This morning, or this afternoon now, I'll be talking about the risks and the problems with connected devices. So this is all the bad news. These are all the things that can go wrong. But hopefully I'll give you examples, real-world examples, of where people have overcome these problems and got it right as well. By brief introduction, Springboard is a company. We are device developers, and we have the privilege of being asked to work on these devices. We develop drug delivery devices and other devices as our day job for pharma companies and for medical device manufacturers. By way of disclaimer, this is written for the purposes of education. We're not trying to give advice on which companies are better than others or which devices are better than others or anything like that. We're just trying to give you real-world examples of where some things have turned into issues and where some companies have overcome those issues in new or innovative ways, and hopefully that will be a good learning experience. We're going to cover a lot of different things in the next 20 minutes or so. We'll start with the risk of unrealistic expectations, so where people think that adding connectivity is going to solve all problems, including adherence, and that is a risk in itself. We'll talk about risk to usability, where you think you're making human factors better, but actually introduce problems. The risk of involving critical functions, where a device has a critical function that you've added electronics or connectivity, and the critical function no longer works, which is a huge risk, and there are real-world examples of that happening. We'll talk about hacking and malware, data silos where devices don't talk to each other properly, the regulatory landscape and the way that that's changing very rapidly, the business models and the risk of getting that wrong, but how people are getting it right too, security of supply, and finally, the environmental impact. So there's a lot of different things to talk about there. We'll cover as much as we can. We'll cover the problems, but also solutions as we go. I'll start with a story, and it's relating to the risk of expecting connected devices to solve all of these problems. 10 years ago, I was asked to lead a team developing a new dry powder inhaler. And our customer said, you've got to think about the human factors. You've got to really worry about that. And we said, sure, we always do. This is part of a normal design process. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, we've got to think a lot more about our patients. He said, I'll give you an example. This is a real-world adverse event report that came back to this company. A lady presented to her doctor with difficulty breathing, and the doctor diagnosed asthma and said, is there anything that's changed in your life which makes you more susceptible to asthma? And she said, well, I have got a cat in the last couple of months. And he said, you've got to lose the cat. You're allergic to your cat. And she said, well, I can't. I love the cat. I'm not losing it. It's not happening. He said, we'll have to manage your asthma. I want you to take this inhaler, use it twice a day, come back in 2 weeks and let me know how you're getting on. She came back in 2 weeks. Asthma was still bad. The doctor said, are you still using your inhaler? And she said, yes, I spray the cat twice a day. So there was a massive breakdown of adherence. She had no idea what she was supposed to be doing. So not only do we have a patient who's not having any benefit at all from the drug delivery device, but we've also got a cat that looks like this. And the reason, everyone will remember the cat, but nothing else about the story. But the reason I mention this is because a lot of people will say, well, adding connectivity would have solved that problem. You would have known that she was doing something wrong. Not necessarily. Some connected devices will register that someone is or is not pressing the inhaler. In this case, that wouldn't have helped. She did press the inhaler. If she had not gone back to the doctor, no one would have any idea that she was not being adherent. But there are devices that are connected which could have supported this. So there are one or two out there that measure the flow rate at the same time. So they would recognize that she was not breathing through the inhaler, and they would have triggered some kind of alert to alert the healthcare provider or to tell her to seek training, something like that. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is a real-world case where you could fall into the trap of thinking that adding connectivity solved a problem when in fact it did not. Perhaps the biggest reason why connectivity is going to be good for adherence is that if someone is not being adherent and you can detect it, you can divert resources to help those people. And the people who are being adherent, you need to worry less about because they're already doing everything correctly. So we'll come back to this story later, but that is the risk, that you think connectivity will solve all your problems. It might not. Okay, let's move straight on to the risks of usability. One of the risks is that you might add user steps to do with things like identification. So sure, your device might connect to the internet or something and report, but how do you know which patient that was? So how do you identify who it went to? How do you connect? Do you connect it to your smartphone? Do you have to connect to Wi-Fi? How do you do that with a device? That's an extra user step. And how do you do things like recharging for the devices that need that? These can all be problems for users. How do we indicate status? So if it connects to something, how do you know it's connected? What happens if you get a new phone? How do you disconnect from the old phone, connect to the new one? These are extra user steps, and you don't know which one you're connected to, and also battery level, which comes up quite a lot, actually, because, for example, the most widely used standard for injection devices is ISO 11608. And part 1 of that says, if you have a battery, you have to indicate the status to the user. So it's an expectation. You do have to do it. But how do you do that? If you have a red light, does that mean it's good or it's bad? It's a very difficult thing to get right with human factors. You've got the risk of misinterpretation. So if you did have a light, does it mean it's connected to the Wi-Fi or to a phone? Does it mean it's ready to inject? Does it mean that it has a problem? You know, these can be easily misunderstood. And lastly, a lot of even connected devices have very poor adherence, amazingly. So there's the risk of disengagement, of people stopping using the thing that you're supposed to be using. So if you look at fitness-related apps, this data is from just a couple of years ago, this is retention after 1 week. And in many cases, these fitness apps are connected to hardware, so Fitbit and so on do have hardware connections like a drug delivery device would have. It's not just a fitness app you just installed on a whim and then deleted. These actually, you might have these devices too. They're getting as low as 55% retention over 1 week. And that makes, for example, inhaler adherence look pretty good at the moment. This is a real problem. And I've got more research that I could share, but I don't have time to talk about why people have such poor adherence and continuation of using mobile apps. By the way, I've noticed some people taking photos. You're very welcome to, but if you come after the talk and give me a business card, I can send you the presentation too. So, how would you solve some of the problems with the usability side of things? Well, the first thing, and I will cite an example of where I personally think this is done well, you can keep the requirements simple. In this case, you've got a device called the Freestyle Libre, which is used to check blood glucose. It's competing against much more complicated devices which continuously do real-world reporting on your blood glucose. This device doesn't. It's something where you actually tap it onto a sensor every few hours, and it will give you the readings up until that time. So it's something that you have a small bit of interaction with, but it massively simplifies the device, and you cut out all of this real-time reporting overhead. So it's a very simple way of doing something. It's been very successful on the market. Another thing to do is to run usability or human factor studies. It sounds obvious, but there's a couple of tips to this I'd like to elaborate on. The first is that you need to get a diverse set of people in your human factor study, diverse ages, different backgrounds, people who are device naive compared to those who are used to using devices, and also if there's going to be other people involved in the therapy, you need to involve them. And this would be particularly for children, involve parents and teachers in the human factor study. If it's going to be given to people who are elderly, you might need carers, for example. And so if it's for something to do with, say, fertility, you might involve partners. So it's very important to get the diverse group of people that are going to be involved in that. And that's probably the best way to head off the usability risks. On to the next risk then. The risk of putting critical functions into the electronics and the connectivity. I'll give you an example here. A few years ago, several insulin pens were released at the same time from different companies, and what they were doing was they were tackling one of the major problems with insulin pens. Just to give you an insight, if you're not familiar with them, with an insulin pen, you would typically dial a dose, which is a safety critical function. You have to get the right dose, and that has to happen, otherwise you can't take your injection. But then there's a couple of things that you would like to know after you've taken your drug. So you want to probably know, when did I last take my dose, and how much did I give myself? Because that's something that's easily forgotten. So different pens came out at the same time. One of them, they thought, well, if we're going to have an LCD, a liquid crystal display, and we're going to display to the user when they last had a dose, we should also use that as a dose counter. That would be cool. But the problem is that's a critical function. So if anything goes wrong, you've just lost the critical functions of your device. And in practice, what happened was they had LCD problems and had battery problems. And they are now critical problems where the device had issues with supply on the market because they had to recall some batches and so on. So that's a real-world example where that was a real problem. If they had added the memory aids separately in some way, they would have avoided causing that issue with their critical functions of their device. I'll give you a couple of examples of how to overcome this. One is quite widespread in the inhaler field, which is where people would take a device which has all the critical functions in it and add on a completely separate device to give you the extra connectivity. If something went wrong with the connectivity, it doesn't affect the core function of the device. You still get your dose, you still are adherent to your regime. So that is a much lower risk way of doing things, and the regulators would recognize that. I'll give you examples of where people have done something similar, but actually taken, instead of a completely separate device, put the technology into the device, but not affected the core function. So if you look at this insulin pen on the left, that still has, I'll just point up here, a dose counter, which is the original mechanical dose counter. They've added the electronics onto the end, which tells you when you took your last dose and how much you took. If that failed, the electronics on the end, you can still take your dose. It's not a critical function. So no patient is going to be harmed if there was an issue. And in the middle, we have inhalers here, where the dose delivery and the dose counter are still the proven mechanical system. They've added this backpack, this bulge on the back, which has the connectivity, which gives you the added benefit, but they have not added risk. And lastly, I'll cite a blood glucose meter, the IBG STAR, where that has this add-on to the bottom of the iPhone in this case, and that add-on has a little LCD display which displays your blood glucose level. So if the iPhone failed, you can still get your blood glucose level and safely choose how much insulin to inject later. So the iPhone is then used to provide connectivity to take the data and put it onto the cloud or to your healthcare provider or something, or to display what your trend is over time, all of these extra helpful things that are not safety critical in the moment. So they're very good strategies for reducing that risk. On to the next problem, the risk of hacking and malware. I don't know if you recognize these characters. This was from a US TV program called Homeland. On the right is a person who's the US president, and on the left is a terrorist. And the storyline goes that the terrorist hacks the US president's pacemaker to cause an assassination, to kill him. And it's not too far from the truth. This was in 2012, and if I give you an example, in 2008, a real-world demo of hacking the pacemaker was shown. You can do it. It's a real-world case. In that case, to give you an example, it was to do with the encryption keys that are allowed. So with encryption keys, one of the main properties of a good encryption key is that it's extremely difficult to guess. You can't brute force it. You can't just try lots of encryption keys and get the right one. A company used an encryption key, which is a good idea, but the encryption key was the serial number of the device. So you didn't even have to get to that device. All you had to know was what format the serial number was, and you just try 1,000 and you've probably got the right one. And the device will respond if you get the right one too. It'll come back and say hello, and you're in. So we've also got lots of examples of demos, and more recently, just last year, there was the first recall of a drug delivery device due to a cybersecurity risk, of the risk of hacking. It was recalled, taken off the market by FDA. The solutions to these are to use, there's lots of good practice, which we won't have time to go into today, but I could talk more about it another time, is to use good practice such as encryption. There's lots of different protocols and ways around that for both the storage and the transmission of data. And also to use red teams for testing. And red teams are not something that's often used in the pharmaceutical industry. So I'll explain briefly what they are. That's where you employ people either within your organization or outside your organization to, their sole purpose is to hack your systems. And they are allowed to do whatever they can to try to break your security. It's used widely in the tech industry, but not so much yet in pharmaceutical industry. But it's a strong recommendation, if you're in this area, you form a red team and give them the remit to break your systems however they will, and just test them. On to the next risk, the risk of data silos. So this is where you have different companies coming up with technology, and the different technologies don't talk to each other. And a classic example in diabetes is where you have an insulin pump and a continuous glucose meter, and the two don't talk to each other. So you can't get your glucose meter to tell your pump how much insulin to give you. It's a common and real-world problem at the moment. And the way to get around that is that there's a set of different campaigns going on. I'll explain some of them now, because I think that they're useful outside the diabetes field as well. It's to do with standards and frameworks. So how to break down these silos. For example, there's a lot of interoperability guidance and standards coming out. So the FDA has a strategy around this, so an actual long-term strategy to try and make this, and they've actually started putting out guidance around insisting on interoperability. Most of it is risk-based. UL has a standard that's just recently come out, and there's also Health Level 7, which has been around for some time. So there's a lot of regulatory sort of expectation around interoperability. There's also these grassroots campaigns. I don't know if you've heard of these. So they go under the hashtag, "We are not waiting." So these are people, this is an example from the diabetes field again. This is where people who either live with diabetes or they have family members, so they might be the parents of a child with diabetes, are hacking their glucose meters and their pumps to make them work together. There's a website called Night Scout where people are showing you how to do this. They say, at your own risk, you can do this, but we're not waiting for interoperability. We want it now. There's also a set of protocols and software called OpenAPS. APS stands for Artificial Pancreas System, so it's the closed-loop insulin delivery. And there's a non-profit organization called Tidepool, which is taking those technologies, putting them together, and getting them FDA approved. So their raison d'etre is to go and have these kind of grassroots technologies approved officially, so that then they can recommend to people, you should actually do this, it does work. Tidepool's actually getting some momentum now. So for example, Dexcom, probably the most significant continuous glucose meter, has signed up to be an open CGM. And Tandem on the pump side has done that, and various others in the industry are looking into this as well. So it's a real movement that's happening. And lastly, we have proprietary integrations. So this is where companies are saying, it is a mess out there, we'll try and bring this all together. So Gluco is doing it in the diabetes field, and Redox, or sometimes called Redox Engine, I think their website's redoxengine.com, they are trying to take data from all sorts of data sources, put them into a common format, and then you can generate medical records and web interfaces and all of this sort of stuff, so that they've broken down the barriers between the technologies. We'll move now to risks around the regulatory landscape. We've talked briefly about interoperability, so I won't repeat that part. Cybersecurity we've only just touched on, but FDA has released some draft guidance to do with the pre-market submissions. They also have some final guidance out for post-market management with regards to cybersecurity. And there's also some guidance around cybersecurity for networked devices where you have off-the-shelf software and how to approve that. We're seeing another aspect of connected devices being regulated, which is data protection. So perhaps the biggest example would be in the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation, for which the UK is still subject to. And you're seeing that across other jurisdictions now as well. So in the USA, they're doing it more on a state level, California perhaps being the most advanced in this process. But data protection is an increasing bar to meet, and probably rightly so. And lastly, we've got approvals of medical devices which are based on third-party systems. So the classic one would be a medical device based on a smartphone, where you don't have any control over iOS or over Android or whatever system. It may change under your feet, but how do you deal with that? So the regulatory authorities are putting in place ways of dealing with that, and I'll just give you an example now. So I'd like to talk through how other people have overcome these regulatory hurdles, perhaps, and how they've done it. A live core is worth noting because it's a live core being the company and Cardia being the app. It's the first FDA approval of a medical device based on a smartphone. It came out about 3 or 4 years ago, or had the approval about 3 or 4 years ago. If you get a chance to talk to people from a live core, they're very good at explaining how they did it, and they're very open with explaining sort of what worked and what didn't work for them and how they did that path. I can put you in touch with them if you're interested. So that was a real groundbreaker. It's the first time the FDA said, okay, you don't have control over iOS, but we will approve this as a medical device. And next up would be MySugar, which is it's almost like the Facebook for diabetes, if you like. And it's now bought by Roche. It has a bolus calculator, a logbook, and those pieces of software are regulated. They are approved as medical devices in themselves. And lastly, the Medtronic 670G is a closed-loop insulin pump system where you have a blood glucose meter and an insulin pump, closed loop, which will then give you the right amount of insulin. And that has also been approved recently. The reason why it's important for connectivity is because the CGM, glucose meter, and the pump do need to talk to each other, and that is a safety-critical communication, and that has been approved. Let's move on to our next risk. I think we're doing okay for time. We're blasting through them. The risk around business models. I'm not going to talk about how to generate value in itself. We've seen some good talks on that earlier. But what I will do is talk about the kind of dilemma that people are facing and a couple of examples of business models that do seem to be working. If you look in the consumer field, you tend to have one person who chooses what they want, they pay for it, and they get the benefit. And that's quite a simple model. You kind of know who your audience is and who you're trying to sell to. In pharmaceuticals and medical devices more widely, you might have a healthcare professional who chooses or at least recommends to the patient what to do or what to have. You have someone paying for it, which may be an insurance company or National Health Service or someone like that. And typically the patient would get the primary benefit in terms of better adherence or better control over their regime. So it's quite a different model. So who exactly is paying for this? Let me give you a couple of examples of business models where people are trying to see how they can make the ecosystem work for them. So an example would be Amgen and Humana. This is where they're taking data from lots of different sources, including smart drug delivery devices, so that they can then predict the risk of adverse events before they happen. You can imagine the value here being that, for example, with one of the drugs, say Repatha, which they're doing this kind of work for, that's used for cardiovascular issues, so basically strokes, myocardial infarctions. And if you could prevent a stroke, that's a serious value proposition. Obviously, there's a massive human impact of improving people's lives. That's clear. Massive benefit to the patient. But also, a patient who has a preventable stroke is then a huge financial burden on that insurance company going forward. And so there's a massive value in predicting the risk of strokes and heart attacks. If we look at what United are doing with Qualcomm, they have a system where they have a Fitbit-based rewards program. In this case, it's not a drug delivery device, but it is a connected device. And they're saying, if you adhere to a regime, in this case, a fitness regime, we will actually give you $1,500. It's not an insignificant amount, because they believe that if people are adhering to their regime, they will have far less secondary healthcare issues. There are many others out there. I just don't have time to cover them all, I'm afraid. But I wanted to show you how people are breaking through the barriers to the business models. Let's talk about risks of the security of supply. So pharmaceutical companies obviously want things like dual sourcing and reliable sourcing. In the electronics industry, they tend to have a very fast turnover of devices. They go end of life quite quickly. It's quite common to have an electrical component go end of life while you're still developing that device. So you haven't even got to market yet, and some of your supply chain has gone end of life. So the solutions around that are to pay for support, to use companies or their products where you probably do pay a premium, but at least they can guarantee long-term support for that product. They won't go end of life. Or you can stockpile, which is a bit, and some companies do as a risk mitigation factor. Another way of looking at things is where people want dual sourcing. So if supplier one has an issue, you can go to supplier two. And this actually happened to a colleague of mine a few years ago, where they had checked out that they could do dual sourcing. In this case, it was a memory chip. And they made sure they had two completely independent sources of this memory chip that was cross-compatible. Then there was an earthquake in Japan. And supplier one came back and said, sorry, we've got no supply for a few months. So my colleague said, no problem, we'll go to supplier two. And they replied, sorry, we've got no supply for a few months. So what's going on here? It turned out they got the silicon wafer that was specific to the memory chip from the same supplier. And that hadn't been checked. So the key here is to go back down the supply chain, because the electronic supply chains can be much more complicated than for sourcing, say, plastics. So the solutions here are to have a full supply chain audit, actually go back all the way down and check the risk. And also you can have supply chain diversity, so don't base them all in the same country, for example, and also disaster planning. So what happens if something happened like this? Do we have a route through? Again, that was a real-world example where it actually happened. We have the risk of environmental impact. It's clearly an important thing. People are recognizing it more and more, and people are simply less willing to put up with excuses as to why it can't be done. So the risk of environmental impact is growing. It's not going to go away, and wishful thinking won't help. So what can we do about environmental impact? There's actually quite a lot. And I suggest that we do start working on this before the regulators insist on it. That will come. So there are strategies. We could add electronics and associated hardware only where necessary. If it's not needed, don't add it. You can move towards reusable devices, and we see that in many cases. Either the device itself is reusable or the add-on is attached to a disposable, but the add-on is reusable. You can return to manufacturer. GSK is already doing this for their inhalers like Ellipta, where when you get the inhaler, it has a package that you can then put the inhaler into with an address on it, and it just goes back to them. They disassemble it and try to recycle. And then also we, as device engineers, I don't know if you guys are device engineers, but we as device engineers can design for ease of disassembly to make that recycling much easier. These are all things we can do. I've talked about all the bad things that can happen and all the problems. I've added this slide for balance. I'm not going to go through all the detail. There are benefits to connected devices. There are benefits to the patient, for the payer, for the carers, the healthcare professionals, the healthcare providers, so hospitals and such, and also for the pharma companies. There's a lot of detail on this slide. I won't go through it in huge amount of detail because I'm aware that everyone wants to get on with their day quite soon. But I wanted to add this for balance because there's quite a lot of compelling reasons why you would use connectivity. Are we doing okay for time there, Michael? Perfect, okay. So we've, in only 20 minutes, covered a huge amount of ground. We've covered the risk of unrealistic expectations, people thinking it will solve all the problems if we had connectivity, the risk of usability, damaging the critical functions and stopping them working, the hacking and malware, data silos, the regulatory issues, business, security of supply, and environmental impact. And lastly, I'd like to bring you back to that unrealistic expectation. I gave you the example of the lady who had asthma and she had sprayed her cat. If those are the sorts of issues we're dealing with on the adherence side of things, there is, of course, a way of doing this where we can add connectivity which can alert the patient that they're doing things wrong, direct them to training materials, or let the healthcare provider or their clinician know that something's going wrong. If we do that right, then we get patients that are more adherent, more healthy, and better human outcomes. And lastly, we have happier cats. So I'd like to finish on that note. Perhaps any questions?
Just admit it. Tom, it's your cat. It's his cat. He just wants to show off with his cat. Question for Tom. Nobody dares.
Oh, maybe I covered everything, hopefully.
Then a question maybe also on behalf of my co-chair, because also humoristically brought but seriously meant. So we were discussing before, the two of us, about connected devices and connected healthcare, and Professor Arno was saying, but you also have your family members and people used to live maybe at the same farm for more generations and taking care of each other. So what would you see as the future where the human interface comes into all of this, you know? I'm not talking about do we need families or so, but what type of social fabric of human beings together would be needed or would be required or would be even wanted to make this flourish together with the technology?
Yes. That's a very good question. So there are various people working on strategies around this. So if you look at some of the connectivity strategies, they actually are more like a system, a bit like, I don't know if you've heard of an organisation called Weight Watchers, or now WW, where people would have a peer group and they would be able to share their experiences and also sort of compare how they're getting on to other people and share advice in a kind of informal way. I'm not talking about official medical advice, but they could at least collaborate with each other and actually share their experiences and their path through things. That already happens with things like weight loss. It happens also in some areas like fertility, where particular people are going through a thing at the same time, and it's a difficult path to tread. And the peer group is very important. And it's also happening more widely in other areas, particularly chronic diseases like, for example, diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis. So you are getting these peer groups forming, and a connected drug delivery device or other medical devices like glucose sensors, they can form as part of that story in the same way that you have people who are into fitness might have an app called like Strava or or Map My Run, things like that. They would then be able to have this sort of social network where they compare their performance, their experience. In the same way, drug delivery devices might do the same thing. That is happening already, as I say, in things like the diabetes field.
And is then trust the word to keep in mind, as a glue to keep communities together? Mutual trust?
Yes, I think so, yeah. And it's going to be very important as well. And I'd like to just briefly touch on trust, because one of the biggest risks to the whole strategy around connected devices, it only takes one organisation or one product to not do trust very well, and suddenly patients will lose trust in the whole industry. If we have, I don't know if you're familiar with the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, where people's data was used for something completely different to what they thought it was being used to. If any company in our industry makes a mistake, either deliberately or by accident along those lines, it would cause immense damage to the future of connected devices. So trust is very, very important.